They're got all the way through 5 now. So boundary injuries. Today we're going to be talking about what goes wrong. Last week we looked at how boundaries were developed, and we talked about how boundaries are not inherited. They are built moment by moment in stages all throughout our lives. We looked at there's 2 stages where boundaries are developed, and one is bonding, and that's the foundation of the boundary foundation is bonding, and that happens early. Like we have a brand new grandbaby here represented in the class, and that baby is already starting to learn boundaries. So these boundaries start to develop even as infants. We start with that connection with the mom. Then the next stage is the separation and individuation, and that has 3 stages. We talked about the hatching, how mommy and me are not the same, practicing, or I can do anything, and then that rapprochement, French word, that I can't do everything, and how that happens, and then how it happens again in adolescence, and how it happens again in young adulthood. So these are some theories that we mentioned. So that gave like a framework on which we could see how things are supposed to develop. So it gives us kind of a mental framework there. But what about when that doesn't happen that way? And I think everyone in this room, we may have had some of the good stuff, but all of us are going to have some of the bad stuff. All of us have boundary injuries in some way. So today we're going to look at those. So here are our pictures for that's a boundary that isn't quite doing what it needs to do. And another one. So these are some boundary injuries. Now I thought that one was pretty good. It looks pretty together. I mean, if you stood back, that might only be a really small hole, but it's still a boundary injury. So today we're going to start looking at the boundary problems, and here's your first fill in the blank. Just like boundary development is rooted in lots and lots and lots of situations and incidents and different things that happen, boundary problems are rooted in thousands of encounters with others, and also our own nature and our own personality come into play. So it's not a simple equation. There are even if you have 2 people in the very same family, you will see different issues. And they may have different boundary issues, even if they're in the same family, because they've had different experiences. So who are the most influential people in our boundary formation? Parents. Mom and dad, maybe another caregiver, someone who has had the most influence in our lives. Those are the ones who help us with our boundary, the formation of those boundaries, good or bad. So here's number 1. First boundary injury is withdrawal from boundaries. So here's a little story from the book. It says, I don't know why it happens, but it happens, mused Ingrid over coffee with her friend. Every time I disagree with my mother, even on little things, I feel this terrible sense that she's just not there anymore. It's like she's hurt and withdrawn, and I can't get her back. It's really a horrible feeling to think you've lost someone that you love. So here she is describing, and she's feeling this distance. Why, as an adult, would Ingrid feel that her mother has withdrawn or that she's lost her mom? Why would she feel, the mom is there, she's talking to her, but why would she feel that way? Maybe the mother really does withdraw. How can a person withdraw from you? What are some things that they might do to give you that signal? Clam up. Quit calling. Have you ever heard a tone in someone's voice?
Yes.
I remember, I was doing this yesterday, and I remember, like with my mom's been gone now for about 15 years, and I just remember growing up, and I would sense that, I would hear that tone, and I remember there would be a switch in me. It was a trigger. There was a trigger there. It's like I would hear her tone change, and something would trigger in me, and I knew. And you know what I'm talking about. There are these trigger mechanisms, and you hear it. Because her mom probably did withdraw, and that's probably how, that didn't just start as an adult. Those triggers start very, very young. And so, just those triggers, or have you heard of Pavlov's dog? Conditioned. We are conditioned to respond in a certain way. And that happens with our families. And so probably when Ingrid was bad or didn't do quite what the mom wanted her to do when she was growing up, there was some response that the mother gave, and the mother may not have even known it. We give responses to other people, and we don't even know it. If you ask your family, they would probably go, yeah, you do such and such, and you do such and such, and we might not even be aware that we're doing that. So somehow the love was withdrawn. But the mother is saying, basically, this is what's happening. When you are good, I will stay connected to you. When you are bad, I'm going to withdraw. Now, if relationship and being connected to somebody is one of the most important things in our lives to our emotional well-being, what does that do? What do we start doing? I have got to stay connected to this person, and I am going to do whatever it takes. I will change my behavior. We might not even realize we're doing it. But because there's such a drive to stay connected, I will do whatever it takes to stay connected to this person so that I feel okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Curtis, do you have any comment?
Just wanted to also say, how often do we do that in other people's lives? They've hurt us, and we're going to make them pay. So it's not just the us getting wounded when someone does it to us, but it's us not knowing that we're wounding other people when they do it to us too.
Two-way street. So we may be doing this and not even know, or maybe we do know. I mean, there may be that note to self, I'm going to make them pay. You know, that unspoken little thing. Here's commentary from Boundaries. It says, when parents detach from a misbehaving young child, instead of staying connected and dealing with the problem, God's constant love is misinterpreted. When parents pull away in hurt, the parent may just be hurt. The parent's feelings might be hurt. You know, we talk about how a child gets their feelings hurt. Parents, don't we, as parents, get our feelings hurt? When a child does something that we, you know, it could be as a child, a small child, or as an adult, the child does something and our feelings get hurt. There may be, when a parent pulls away in hurt, disappointment, or passive rage. Passive-aggressive anger. We can have passive rage going on. They are sending this message to their youngster. Here's what they're saying. You are lovable when you behave, and you are not lovable when you do not behave. So then how does that translate? Here is the child, here's what, and you have done this, and you see if this makes sense. The child in their head, subconsciously, there's an equation going on. When I'm good, I'm loved, and when I'm bad, I'm cut off. So, if our deepest need is to belong and to be in relationship and have an emotional home, here's what's going on. Here's your next fill in the blank. Parents who pull away from their child are in essence practicing spiritual and emotional blackmail. When you are good, I will reconnect with you. Is that making sense? Some of you, I'm not trying to talk to you as parents. I'm trying to talk to you as somewhere in you is a child. And that may sound really weird to you. But if you have been injured as a child, so many times we are stuck at that age. If there was a major traumatic event that happened in our lives, we can be stuck at a certain age. We can be physically mature, we can be chronologically mature, but there could be part of us who is stuck. Chris, do you want to address that?
It's called an emotional arrestment, or it's where you can't move past that. Even though you may get older, you can't move past that.
And one of the things, like with Ingrid, she's an adult person, but what's happening to her when she talks to her mom? Something in her is triggering, and she's going back to a child. Just like you can do so much healing in your life and away from your family, God can do all this healing, and you can feel like you've made strides and growth and everything, and you go back into that family situation for a holiday, what happens? Are you the little child again? And you're like, but I made progress. It's real frustrating. And you have to keep, the Holy Spirit has to keep working. So here's another commentary. It says, children whose parents withdraw when the child starts setting limits, because that's what is happening. The child's trying to grow, and they're trying to set limits. But the parent is going, whoa. And so it says that when the child setting limits learns to accentuate and develop their compliant, okay, let me start over on this. Children whose parents withdraw when the child starts setting limits. The child learns to accentuate and develop their compliant, loving, sensitive parts. So the child learns they will love me when I act sensitive and loving and da-da-da-da-da. But they don't love me when maybe I act aggressive or truth-telling. How many times we say out of the mouths of babes, right? They're telling the truth, and we're like, shh, you know? I mean, they've told the truth, and so we do have to teach them. But they're like, I just told the truth. They do have bad breath. You know? They do have bad breath. I know they have bad breath, but you don't have it. Okay? If someone they love pulls away when they become angry, cantankerous, or experimental during that practicing stage, children learn to hide those parts of themselves. If they're getting in trouble for being a certain way or saying a certain thing or acting a certain way and they get in trouble for it, are they going to keep doing that? Some kids might, but some kids are going to start, there's this constant gauging going on where it's like, okay, I can't act that way. I remember doing it. Maybe I'm by myself. But it says, and the author goes on to say, parents who tell their children, it hurts me when you're angry, and we may have put it that way at some point, makes the child responsible for the emotional health of the parent. Does that make sense? It hurts me when you are angry. Okay. So in effect, the child has just made the parent to be the parent of the parent. So here's a different way, and maybe at 2 or 3 years old. So here's a different way you can say that, and it doesn't convey that same meaning. It's far better to say, I know you're angry, but you're still not going to get the toy. Do you see the difference in those? One is saying, you have the power to hurt me, and the other one is saying, I know you're angry, but you're not going to get the toy. There's a different connotation associated with each of those. One is giving the child some sort of power over, you have power over making me feel a certain way. And the other is just saying, here are the facts. You can be angry, but you're still not going to get the toy. It's just a factual statement. It has nothing to do with emotions. And then the adult can turn around. If the adult is really dealing with feelings of hurt or disappointment or whatever, they can then take those to their spouse or a friend or the Lord. But they don't have to put that responsibility of their emotional well-being on a child. Is that making sense? Mm-hmm. That's a heavy load for a child to carry.
It is.
And so you see the difference between those two. By nature, children are omnipotent. They think they are powerful enough to make things happen. And it says, if the sun is shining, they must have been good, and if it's raining, they must have been bad. Some of them can think that way. If mom and dad are okay, I must have been good, and if mom and dad are not okay, I must have done something wrong. If mom and dad got a divorce, what's the equation? And I've told you it must have been my fault. And I've told you about my situation of being hit in the face with that when Macaulay would have been probably 4 or 5, driving down the road. Sarah was probably about 18 months, and we're driving down the road, single parent, and divorced right after I started divorcing when I was pregnant with Sarah and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, Sarah never knew us married, my husband and I, or their dad and I. And so Macaulay, here he is like 4 or 5, out of the blue goes, when you and Dad got divorced, was that my fault? Out of the blue. I was like, oh no, that was not your fault. Well, was it Sarah's fault? She came about that time. This is a 4 or 5-year-old. That's how he was computing. That was his omnipresentness. I am powerful enough to have some bearing on that. And I had no clue. And so, thankfully, he said something, and anyway, so it just shocked me. But a parent's emotional withdrawal can be subtle, the silent or hurt tone, maybe long silence, silent treatment. Or it could be very overt, and they could be very demonstrative and very dramatic, crying. I think of Italian families. Have you seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding?
Yeah.
That's a Greek family, that are very demonstrative, and if one of the children doesn't do what they want, oh my gosh, it's that's sending some signals. Children and parents like these grow up to be adults who can be terrified that setting boundaries will cause severe isolation and abandonment. So here our greatest need is to be connected with people, and so here as an adult, grown up physically, grown up chronologically, that there's something in them that is emotionally, there's a deficit. There's an injury. I won't say there's a deficit. There's an injury that has happened. And so they're still dealing with it. So I put in my notes here, let me speak some freedom. If you're dealing with that kind of situation, if you can realize whatever happened back there was not your fault, but that was the parent dealing with their own issues. Does that make sense? That'll take the responsibility off of you. Like I've told you, my brother teased me incessantly, and that computed in my little brain that something was wrong with me. And then as an adult, when God started healing that, and somebody said, but look at it from his perspective. Here he was 4 years older than you, had a good thing going, and then this little blue-eyed, blonde-haired little girl shows up on the scene who gets all the attention all of a sudden. So I was the baby of the family. So he was dealing with his own jealousy and his own issues with me showing up on the scene. And that was like a switch for me. That was like freedom for me. It wasn't me. He was dealing with his own stuff. That was like paradigm shifting when I realized it wasn't me. It wasn't some deficiency that I had or something wrong with me or whatever. It was him. And he hadn't dealt with his own stuff. He was dealing with his own stuff, and can you see how this all weaves together? When somebody else is dealing with their own stuff and then they pile it off on you, and you take it up, and you don't have to, it can be very freeing. Okay, number 2, hostility. Hostility against boundaries. So here's a story from Boundaries. It says, do I understand why I can't say no? Larry chuckled. Why don't you ask me a hard one? I grew up in the military and Dad's word was law. And disagreeing was always rebellion. I contradicted him once when I was 9, and all I remember is waking up on the other side of the room with a whopping headache and lots of hurt feelings. Hostility toward boundaries is when the parent becomes angry at the child's attempts at separating from him or her. The child is trying to separate and form their own identity, and the parent gets mad about it and says, you are not going to do that. Hostility can emerge in the form of angry words, physical punishment, or inappropriate consequences. And here, okay, See if you recognize this scenario. Here's the parent talking. You are going to do what I say. Fair. Fair. As parents, we are given responsibility over our children, and sometimes we have to pull that card. You are just do what I say. Fair. And you are going to like it. Not fair. The first part of that is fine. You are going to do what I say. I am your parent. You have to do this. You might not like it, but you have to do it. That's what I usually tell my parents. You might not like it, or tell my kids, you might not like it, but if you have to do it. Telling them they're going to like it is confusing to them. I don't like it. So you're telling me that I have to like it? That can be a very, very confusing statement. Because it says it is confusing to the child because it's a denial of the separate soul of the child. It's not letting them be a separate person. To make the child like it is to pressure the child into becoming a people pleaser and not a God pleaser. Here's Galatians 1:10. Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God, or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. So are we supposed to discipline our children? Yes. But what is discipline? Here's what they say in the book. It says, discipline is the art of teaching children self-control by using consequences. Irresponsible actions should cause discomfort that motivates us to become more responsible. So, cause effect. If you do this, then this is going to happen. The my way or else approach teaches children to pretend to be obedient. Do you have a choice? So you have the my way or else approach, or you have a choice approach, which teaches children to be responsible for their own actions. Instead of saying, you'll make it or you will be grounded for a month, the parents can say, you have a choice. You can make your bed and I'll let you play with your Nintendo, or don't make your bed and you will lose Nintendo privileges for the rest of the day. And at that point, the child has a choice. They have a choice. I can do this and this is the consequence, or I can do this and this is the consequence. And it's the child's choice. Then it's just, So does God discipline us? Yes, He does. Hebrews 12:10-11. For our earthly fathers disciplined us for a few years, and here's a good news for all of us, doing the best they knew how. And that's true for all of us. We're doing the best we know how, or we have done the best we know how. So you don't have to beat yourself up. If they're, we've done the best we know how, and God gives us credit for that. But God's discipline is always good for us so that we might share in His holiness. No discipline is enjoyable while it is happening. It is painful. But afterward there will be a peaceful harvest of right living for those who are trained in this way. So if there's a hostile parent, what are they teaching? What is the child trying to do if there's hostility in the family, or that they're having to deal with? Just to avoid wrath. There's no love involved. Curtis wants to.
But when they grow up, what they learn is whoever's the strongest wins.
Right.
And that's what you teach them. I mean, that's what they're taught in a hostility environment. Who's ever the strongest wins.
Because the parent is the strongest, and there's that. At some point, that child may have said, I will never let this happen to me. When I get out of here, I will never let this happen to me again. And so then they may get into a situation to where they are going to be the one who wins. And then what it is, it propagates. What you plant, you will sow. And it propagates, that's what's being planted, and so that's what they know. And so then you can also see the opposite. None of this is cut and dry, but a lot of times hostility produces hostility, and you see it in the next generation. with both withdrawal and hostility. It doesn't matter which. One is more aggressive, and one might be easier to see. Hostility may be a little more, the withdrawal is maybe a little harder to see maybe at times. But in both, the child's being manipulated. Does God ever manipulate us? No. Here is 1 John 1:5. It says, "This is the message we heard from Jesus, and now declare to you, God is light, and there is no darkness in him at all." God does not manipulate us. He'll give us choices, and does he let us live out the consequences of our own choices? Absolutely. I know I have. He has told me it's okay. You can go ahead and go down that path, but then you'll face the consequences of it. And then he helps me through the consequences. But I could have avoided them.
And sometimes we need to let our children,
Absolutely.
instead of rescuing them,
Absolutely.
sometimes they need to suffer the consequences of their choices.
Yep. And we're going to get to that here in a little bit. Here's one. Hostility can create problems of both saying and hearing no. I messed that up. Some children become pliably enmeshed with others. You can have a situation where they get so enmeshed with the family that there's a codependency going on. But some react outwardly and become controlling people, just like the hostile parent. The Bible addresses two distinct reactions to hostility in parents. Here's what it says. Colossians 3:21, "Fathers, don't scold your children so much that they become discouraged and quit trying." And Ephesians 6:4, "And now a word to you parents, don't keep on scolding and nagging your children, making them angry and resentful. Rather bring them up with the loving discipline the Lord himself approves, with suggestions and godly advice." Number 3, we have over-control. This happens when there are just too many controls. The parents put the child in a bubble. You can't go do that because you'll get too dirty. You can't play with those children because there'll be a bad influence, and there may be some of those that you don't want them to play with, but the child's got to have, if the child has no friends because of that, then you either need to move to a different neighborhood. The child's got to have some kids to play with. And so it's just too confining. And when the child has grown up in an over-controlled environment, what can happen? There are a couple of things that can happen. They're afraid of everything, and they're afraid to try anything. They're afraid to, because they've been told everything is bad, the world is bad, the world is scary, and you can't go out and do that. Or what happens, I've seen this so many times, they go to college and what happens?
Yeah, oh my gosh.
No
They
boundaries.
just go wild.
They go crazy. Because they've been controlled and confined so much that they overdo it. So do you see how that's a boundary injury? They don't know, they've been controlled, and now they flunk out of school, they're staying up all night. It's just, you get it. Over-controlled children are subject to dependency, enmeshment conflicts, and difficulty setting and keeping firm boundaries. So over-control can be a problem. Number 4, lack of limits. Here's a story from the book. Eileen sighed. Her husband Bruce was in his twice-a-week mode of throwing fits whenever she dropped the ball. This time he was yelling about having to reschedule their night out with the Billingses. Eileen had forgotten to call a babysitter for the kids until 4 that afternoon. She couldn't understand why Bruce got so wound up about such little things. Eileen had very loving but very indulgent parents. They couldn't stand to make her do anything to discipline her with timeouts, consequences, or spankings. Her folks thought that lots of love and lots of forgiveness would help her be the adult she needed to be. So whenever Eileen didn't pick up after herself, her mother would cover for her. When she wrecked the family car 3 times, her dad got her her own car. And when she overdrew her checking account, her parents quietly put more money in it. After all, isn't that love, they would say. Eileen's parents' lack of limits on her hurt her character development. Though she was a loving wife, mother, and worker, others were consistently frustrated at her undisciplined, careless way of living. It cost others a lot to be in relationship with her, yet she was so lovable that most of her friends didn't want to hurt her feelings by confronting her, so the problem remained unsolved. So this was not just with her husband, it was with other people too. And so this is like the opposite of boundaryless with hostility. The parents, they were just overindulgent. So the adult with a lack of limits has trouble hearing other people's boundaries or needs. So here her husband was going, we need to do this, and she couldn't hear it. She could, he was like, I need to have this done. We need to have this done up here so that we can get things done. And she had the inability to hear his needs or to think that they were important. So he might say something to her, but were they important to him or to her? No. So here, then we have number 5, inconsistent limits. Inconsistent limits send mixed signals because the child doesn't know what to expect from day to day. And some of you, somebody in here is in each of these categories. But alcoholic families often exhibit inconsistent limits. A parent may be loving and kind one day and unreasonably harsh the next day due to their drinking. So a child, just when they come home from school, they just don't know what to expect. And it can throw them into a role of being an adult too early. Now, I've talked to people, friends who would come home and they would go, every time I walked in the door, I didn't know what to expect, and I had to assess the situation and then take care of my younger siblings based on what was going on. Alcoholism causes massive boundary confusion in the child. Adult children of alcoholics never feel safe in relationships. They're always waiting for the other person to let them down or attack them unexpectedly. They keep their guard up constantly. Setting limits is traumatic for the adult children of alcoholics. So that can be very challenging. Curtis, you want to say anything on that?
It just, I see a lot of people, and they don't ever know when the truth is told. They have a desire, they really want it to be true, but when they start to learn the pattern of the parent, it's alcoholic, there's that gnawing feeling inside of them that says, I want it to be, but it can't be, it won't be. And usually the response is anger. They have to start getting angry, and they have to start not liking the parent. And when you start to look at what happens as an adult, it has a tremendous influence on relationships because it's about guarding one's own heart. I was thinking, as we all are starting to look at our own flaws or our own boundary issues, it's interesting how some of us make vows. We'll never be like our parent, and all of a sudden we flip over too far the other way, and then we start seeing the flaws that we're creating in our children. And then sometimes we do it the same way. If we looked at our children as we're stewards, they're really not ours, they're God's. And how are we supposed to do it according to what God says? And you can only do that if you really flip out of your own self, your own inefficiencies or deficits, and you really begin looking at the child as a person and an individual and who God's created them to be. And it's hard to do when you haven't worked through your stuff.
This is the reason it's so important to work through your own stuff. And the only way you can do it is asking the Holy Spirit to help you. He will guide you. I'm just telling you from my own experience. I prayed and I would pray. I knew there were issues in my life. I knew there were. And I would pray, Holy Spirit, I have got to have your help. I have got to have your help. And over time, it might not be an instantaneous thing, but He put books in my path. He put people in my path. And having an open heart to hear Him and to realize this book that I'm reading, I'm not supposed to be applying, oh yeah, I see that in them, and I see that in them. He was having me read it for me. It's easy to read something or hear a sermon and apply it to somebody else. But we're the only ones we have control over. And so, I don't want you guys to hear this and go, I am just a heap of mess. I'm just a one old big heap mess. There's no hope. And you leave here feeling defeated. Please don't. The reason God brings stuff like this up in our lives is so that He can start to heal it. If we're in denial, or if we're not even aware, does He have the opportunity to even start healing? There's got to be some knowledge on our part for Him to go, this is something, yeah, but you don't have to feel defeated about it. I can work all things to the good of those who love me. So now we're going to start working the good. We're going to start turning it around. You don't have to keep living in this bondage. There's freedom available. That's the good news. So please don't leave here going, I cannot go back. I cannot go listen to another Sunday. Don't. There's hope. Please know that there's hope. So the first 5 boundaries that we looked at are character pattern problems. Those are things that happen over time, and this other one can too, but let me show you what I'm talking about. If you have a tree, and it is consistently fed, and if it is consistently undernourished, or if it is consistently trained, it is going to look a certain way. This tree has been trained to look. I even found some pictures of trees that had been trained to be a chair. It was a living tree, and it was a chair. And then there was the bushy part up above, and you could sit. And so there was training. Training took place, and this tree looked a certain way. But if it's undernourished, it's not going to look the same as one that's had the proper nourishment. It's not going to be as full or as healthy and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So this is character building. There's a certain character. This one's been struck by lightning. This is an instantaneous, something big happened, and that would be trauma. There's a difference between the character building things and trauma. A trauma is an intensely painful emotional experience rather than a character pattern. Emotional, and the two can overlap, so I want you to know that, but there's a difference. Emotional, physical, and sexual abuse is traumatic. Those things can be ongoing, but they're a little bit different than the character building ones. See what I'm saying? Accidents and debilitating illnesses are traumatic, either in the person himself or being around it. A person who's had a parent who is sick a lot are going to develop certain fears, certain insecurities, things like that. Severe losses such as the death of a parent, divorce, or extreme financial hardships are also traumatic. So there's a little bit of a difference. How can trauma impact a child? Tornadoes last May. Tornadoes hitting a school. Gun violence in schools. The Sandy Hook, the children who went to Sandy Hook. Divorce in a family. Sexual abuse. Rape. Even loss of a home due to a fire. Especially as a child, and the child has the ability to say it's my fault. That's that omnipresent part of them. So can you see how these are traumatic experiences? Children who undergo trauma become unsure that they are safe and protected in the world, and they become frightened that they have no say-so in any danger that approaches them. They feel it takes away their power. Curtis, do you want to say anything about trauma? Because you deal with a lot of trauma stuff.
It kind of resets your brain a little bit. We have a lot of confidence in our flesh because we can control a lot of things. And whenever something happens so significant and you can't control it, it really makes you question your abilities anymore.
It produces a lot of fear.
Mm-hmm.
Fear, yeah.
So here's a story. Jerry had been physically abused by both of his parents for years. He had left home early, joined the Marines, and had several bad marriages. In therapy as an adult in his 30s, he began realizing why, under his tough exterior, he always longed for controlling women. So the kind of women he always looked for were controlling women. He'd fall madly in love with the fact that they could handle him. Then a pattern of compliance to the woman would emerge, with Jerry always on the losing end. One day in session, Jerry remembered his mother striking him across the face for some small infraction. He vividly remembered his vain attempts to protect himself, pleading, "Please, Mom, I'm sorry, I'll do anything you say, please, Mom." When he promised unquestioning obedience, the hitting would stop. This memory tied in with his lack of power and self-control with his wives and girlfriends. Their anger always terrified him, and he would instantly comply. Jerry's boundary development was seriously injured by his mother's abuse. Do you want to talk about triggers or anything? Okay. That would be a trigger. He had triggers in his life that would get triggered. They were from this kind of situation he had growing up. And here he is as an adult, and those same triggers would fire, and he would have the same response. Trina?
Occurs to ask, what does a child do when they know that they are being like their past parent, but they don't know how to fix it?
Well, the thing that I do is I keep asking God for permission.
What if God's not in their life? Then what's the answer?
Unless they get somebody in their life that's wiser, that doesn't, it's not stuck in it, there's no way that they, in your own ability, you can only know what you know. If they don't get somebody in their life that can speak differently, they're not going to know a difference.
Because I know families that have been consistent disabused or abusing down through multiple generations.
Yeah.
They know it's wrong, and they know they're acting like a past parent, but they don't. But when something happens that's immediate, they don't seem to know how to fix it, even though they know it's wrong.
Well, they're not able to. They're not living in 2013. All that stuff comes up, and it's just a response. And unless they can grab a hold of their behavior, we're always sorry after the fact.
Yeah.
And if they can't grab it in real time, they're not going to do any better.
Can you see how this throws us back into a previous time in our lives? That child, that point in our lives where that abuse took place or that trauma took place or whatever it was, there's part of us as an adult, chronologically, physically adult, that's still back there. And what God has to help us do is grow up emotionally. And because we're stuck. There's part of us that's stuck. It may not even be all of us. It may emotionally. It may just be one part of, a certain part of us emotionally that's stuck at 8 years old or at 10 years old or something. But what happens is whenever we're triggered, the same response that we had at that age is happening now. And so God has to help us grow up and grow past that and bring the healing into our lives. And here's some hope. Here's Luke 4:18, and this is from Isaiah 61:1. The Spirit of the Lord is on me. This is Jesus speaking. He has chosen me to tell good news to the poor. He sent me to tell prisoners that they are free. We may be a 10-year-old prisoner in 100 years. That's what I feel like sometimes. In a 50-year-old body. But we're a 10-year-old prisoner. Or an 8-year-old prisoner or a 6-year-old prisoner. And so he says, I'm here to tell them that they're free, tell the blind that they can see. He sent me to free those who have been treated badly. There is hope, there are promises. That is good news. And we can tap into that. We do not have to stay stuck. We do not have to. The enemy would want to make us feel stuck, but we don't have to stay there. There are two more things that can impact our character development. Our own character traits. Have you heard it said, from the womb, they have been this way. They have been fearful, they have been aggressive, they have been whatever. We are born with certain character traits, and those also impact. You can have, well, it's funny because I hear like Lori Williams talk about her first two children, and then they've got the first two and then the second two. And the first two were very compliant, and I'm not saying that the other two weren't, but the first two were quieter or something. They had a certain personality type that she was used to. Well, then she had the second two. And I see it in another friend of mine. The first two children are quiet, and the younger two children, I had babysat them the other day for this friend of mine. So tired. I mean, they talk, these younger two talk all the time. They are as cute as they can be, but oh my goodness, they're so different than the older two. And so some parents have these first two kids and they think, oh, parenting is easy. Well, they haven't had the other ones. You know, and these people who've had enough kids to see, oh wow, there's a different, all the same DNA, but there's different character qualities, and so these kids have different character, different built-in things, and it's going to impact their boundaries. It just does. I was shy as a child, and that has impacted some of my boundaries. And then number 8, our own sinfulness. And I'm just going to read this because when we're talking about our own sinfulness, I thought, let me just read what they put. We also contribute to our own boundary development problems by our own depravity. Depravity is what we inherited from Adam and Eve. It is our resistance to being creatures under God, our resistance to humility. It's a refusal to accept our position and a lust for being omnipotent and in charge, not needing anyone and not accountable to anyone. Our depravity enslaves us to the law of sin and death, from which only Christ can save us. So those are boundary injuries. Does anybody have any questions, comments, anything like that? There is hope.
I got one. Like on trauma stuff, talks about a lot of times things in your childhood. What about things in your young adult life?
Same thing.
Same thing, because I don't recall too many things or anything like when I was a kid, other than I knew what not to do.
There are things that can happen to us as an adult that can have the very same effect. Soldiers coming back from war, traumatic event, and they come back different. And with challenges they would have never thought. So we can be in a marriage situation that throws us into new territory. We can be in a work situation that throws us into new territory that we just never experienced. Trauma that can happen, some sort of wreck or some sort of accident. Trina?
A lot of people don't understand what PSD is, so when these guys come back from Pakistan, Iraq, Iran, or wherever, people don't realize that they have changed. So I've got 2 son-in-laws that have that. One is son-in-law especially because he was in Iraq, right downtown Baghdad, and shot it all the time. And when he came back, it's been 2 years. People don't understand what these guys go through. They don't have a clue. Don't have a clue.
And it happened in such a short, compared to the rest of the time of their life, a short period of time. And people expect them to come back the same person. And then they're not quite the same person. People don't know how to relate to them. Okay.
Part of it is that our world that we live in is such a surreal as compared to other countries, other places, and we don't have fighting on our streets, and we don't. It just
Yeah, we don't have grenades coming in.
Yeah.
We don't hear. I hear
Even the
fireworks.
poorest people have wealth compared to other countries.
We live right into Logan County, and fireworks can go on whenever. I've heard them recently, and I've thought about that. I've thought, I know that that's fireworks. People in other countries, that's not fireworks.
Yeah.
That is a sign to take cover, and am I going to live through the night? Very traumatic. Okay, well, let's go ahead and